Hey folks, I hope you're doing well today. We're going to be working on an ed puzzle. A little bit of it is going to be lecture from me and then lecture from somebody else, basically a video from YouTube. As we get started today, I want you to think about this journal question here. It kind of builds on some of the topics we were discussing yesterday when we were talking about current events, and applies some of those same general ideas, but to the time period that we're going to be looking at. So I want you to think about, and you can answer this in ed puzzle, is when, if ever, is the use of violence okay for political or economic gain? Okay, so, we've talked a lot about, this point, the Gilded Age and the social and political issues going on in the United States. We talked about the Progressive Era and the response to those issues, whether it be women's suffrage or whether it be the creation of national parks. Or whether it's the way that politicians have solved the political issues in the country itself. Now we enter this whole new time period, and the United States is seeking to become a world power. It's a big change from just focusing on things at home. Okay, and so we're going to understand how we grow politically into this world power and what the United States has to do to make this transformation. Now, this is a topic that you studied extensively last year, and it's known as imperialism. And imperialism is something that's just not inherent to the United States, but it happens all over the world, particularly with European nations. I'd like you to go ahead and look up, using learnersdictionary.com, the definition for imperialism. You can go ahead and do that now and type that into Edpuzzle. Okay, so when we're looking at imperialism, the definition that we're going to use is going to be a little bit different maybe than what you were finding, but we're going to define imperialism as the policy of establishing economic, political, and military dominance over weaker nations. Okay. Now, like I said, this is something that Europe has been doing for a long time, and you studied it last year. But the United States is relatively late to the game in this, kind of taking on imperialist practices late in the 1800s. Now, the United States had been using colonial practices where they had actually taken land from other peoples and settled that land since, the beginning of colonization in the Americas, right? Imperialism is a little bit different because we don't have to actually settle the places that we're taking over. Okay, just economic, political, and military dominance over weaker nations. Okay, this is an illustration of that you can see in the background. Right, there's Uncle Sam, which is the United States, and he is taking over Cuba in this illustration. Okay, under the banner of the American flag. Right. Now we're going to think about the goals of imperialism, and there's really three major goals of imperialism, especially when it comes to the imperialism as brought by the United States, which is obviously our focus. Okay, so the first, and perhaps the one that's necessary, the goal that's necessary for establishing the other two goals, is first the spread of cultural values and American democracy, and with democracy can come capitalism. Okay, so democracy, government by the people, is the kind of government that best supports capitalism. Okay, or an economy based on the private ownership of land and really the means of production. Okay, so things like labor, but natural resources, really. These things need to be privately controlled, not controlled by the government. Okay. Now, the next goal of imperialism is to acquire new resources. For American businesses to succeed, we need access to raw materials. Okay, so whether that's timber or water or raw land for farming different types of crops, or if it's mineral resources like iron or copper or tin or things like rubber, we need access to these new resources. Okay, and we set about establishing outposts throughout the world to bring these resources in. And then the next piece of this, of course, is to find new markets. Okay, we're in this industrial economy, and we have trade with Europe, but we want more markets, more places to sell stuff. And if we go and take over or establish economic, political, and military dominance over other nations, they're obligated to buy things that American businesses produce. Okay, so 3 goals of imperialism: spread cultural values, acquire new resources, and find new markets. Now, we can look at this GIF of, over time, European imperialism, and in just a second here, the United States is going to enter, and you can see these pink areas, falling under American power, and we even see Hawaii here falling under American power. Let's just take a second to look at that. Okay, now we're going to watch this video, and I'm going to go away. There's going to be a few more questions to answer, though.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to Heimlich's History. Now, as America comes out of the Gilded Age, we are filthy rich and itching to flex our collective strength on the world stage. And when we looked around at the world, it turns out that European countries have been flexing their muscles for decades in something called imperialism. And so, not to be outdone, America looked around and decided to gather up some lands for an overseas empire of her own. Now, when I think of America's age of imperialism, the best metaphor to my mind is hunger. Dad is hungry! And in this lecture, we're going to see what Daddy America was hungry for, why Daddy America got so hungry in the first place, and what it was that Daddy found to stuff down his gullet. Let's get to it.
It's time to kick it old school.
So what was Daddy hungry for? Well, first, Daddy was hungry for new markets. You see, America had found a way to grow more food and produce more manufactured crap than the American public could possibly consume. And so, what do you do in that case? Well, you look for foreign markets. And so we trained our eyes on Latin America, Asia, and the Caribbean. But Daddy was also hungry for raw materials. You see, despite the abundance of resources packed under the crust of the American continent, we did not have it all. And so, if we were going to keep feeding those factories, we needed to find other lands that had raw materials that we did not. Okay, that was what Daddy was hungry for. Now, why was it that Daddy was hungry? Well, 2 reasons. First, there was the lingering idea of social Darwinism. You'll recall that guys like John D. Rockefeller applied the principles of survival of the fittest to his business practices. But now he decided to apply those principles at the level of nations as well. America had proved herself to be one of the strongest and fittest in the world, and therefore was justified in finding the weak and consuming them. Daddy's hungry! But the second reason Daddy was hungry was because of that old idea of manifest destiny. That was the old idea that God had given us the right to possess the entirety of the continent from sea to shining sea. And at this point, we had done it. All the land which we can now consider the lower 48 states were in our possession. The great expanse of America stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific seaboards. And listen, a hunger like that doesn't just die off overnight. For example, I love gummy bears. And just because I eat a 4-pound bag of gummy bears today doesn't mean I'm going to be satisfied for the rest of my life. Next morning, I'm going to wake up thinking I could do that all over again. So even though the Civil War distracted us for a little while, now that everything was put back together again, Daddy Daddy was hungry for more. And since we had nowhere else to go on this continent, we had to look elsewhere. Now, not surprisingly, this impulse got us into some skirmishes, most notably the Spanish-American War of 1898. Now, in order to tell this story, we need to begin in Cuba. Now, Cuba had been part of the Spanish Empire since the late 1400s, and the Cubans had had just about enough of foreign imperial rule. And so the Cubans roused themselves into a revolt against their Spanish lords. Now, if you'll recall, way back in the day, America embraced something called the Monroe Doctrine. And I compared the Monroe Doctrine to a dog lifting its leg and peeing all over the Western Hemisphere. And here's why. Because the Monroe Doctrine said that everything in the Western Hemisphere essentially belongs to America. And therefore, we don't want any European intervention over here. So as it turns out, Cuba happens to be in the Western Hemisphere and therefore could not avoid the sprinkle of the American urinary habit of imperialism. And so America took up the Cuban cause. Now, why would America want to do this? Well, at least one reason was something that came to be known as yellow journalism. And essentially what was going on is that people like Joseph Pulitzer were publishing in their newspapers accounts that were both spurious and outlandish about Spanish atrocities against the Cubans in order to arouse public support for the Cuban cause. Now, in many cases, there was a kernel of truth to these, but they were blown way out of proportion. So at this point, the American public was clamoring for a fight, and so we sent our newest Navy destroyer down to Cuba and just parked it right in Havana Harbor. Nothing going on here, just came down to say, hey! And as you can imagine, this move caused an awful lot of tension between America and Spain. But nothing really happened until one day. In the evening of February 15th, 1898, the USS Maine exploded, killing 260 American sailors. Now, of course, Joseph Pulitzer and his army of yellow journalists jumped all over this. They pumped out ream after ream of newspapers accusing the Spanish of destroying the Maine. Now, just so you know, in 1976, the U.S. Navy did an extensive investigation into the explosion. And what they found was that the overwhelming amount of evidence suggested an internal explosion, which is to say it was not, in fact, caused by the Spanish. But investigating the truth didn't much matter to the American public. We wanted Spanish blood. Now, to emphasize just how much Americans wanted to get into a fight, despite any action that might lead to a diplomatic solution, you should know that American diplomats presented Spain with a list of demands saying, do this and we will not go to war. And apparently, Spain really did not want to go to war with America because they complied with all of the demands, including the most stringent of them, to which America said, no, we really didn't think y'all would do all that. Y'all still want to start a war? All right, we're going to go to war. Wait, what? Why? Well, President McKinley knew how unwise it would be to not start a war because, hey, elections were coming up. And if he didn't give the people what they wanted, then they wouldn't re-elect him. And that is how you get the Spanish-American War. Now, I'll just cut to the end of what McKinley called the splendid little war because it only lasted for 114 days. And I'll let you know that America triumphed on behalf of the Cubans and repulsed Spain from the last scrap of their once vast New World empire. And one of the strange strategies we employed to win this battle in the Caribbean was by invading another Spanish possession way over in the Pacific, namely the Philippine Islands. And the freedom-loving Filipinos were like, yay, the Americans are here to make us free. And as the war closed, we sat across the treaty table from Spain and took the Philippine Islands off their hands for a cool $20 million. And once President McKinley saw how backwards and brown and unchristian these Filipinos were, actually, don't tell anybody, but their leader was highly educated and the Filipinos were already mostly Christians, McKinley decided to do the right thing and keep the Filipinos under American rule until they became, more American. And since the Philippine Islands were just so dang far away, we began to think that we needed a rest stop. Someplace between our western coast and Asia, where we could just chill and eat some coconut meat. Maybe someplace like, Hawaii. So in 1898, America went ahead and brought a bunch of diseases to the native Hawaiians and killed a bunch of them off and was like, so if y'all aren't using these islands anymore, we'll take them. And that's how you get the 50th state of the United States. Now, with all this imperialistic activity, there arose, not surprisingly, a great clamor from a bunch of people saying, This is wrong. The folks who were saying this were called the Anti-Imperialist League, and they argued that America should not be taking over nations and ruling other peoples because, in case you forgot, there's a deep conviction in the soul of America that people must be governed by their own consent. A philosopher during that time named William James put it magnificently. He said he couldn't believe that America could puke up its ancient soul in 5 minutes without a wink of squeamishness. But on the other side of the argument were the expansionists. They raised arguments about patriotism and about how America had a civilizing mission in the world. Not to mention that the possibilities for the expansion of trade were positively fabulous. And in the end, it was the expansionists who won out. And on February 6, 1899, Congress approved the treaty with Spain, and America became an empire. And that's all we have time for now. I'll see you next time.